How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Great topic coming our way today. Working with the weak supervisor. Guys, I titled this, Stop Giving the Inmates What They Want. Obviously, this is something that I'm sure the front line can relate to. But I will say this. This topic today is not about what we need to do on the front line to deal with the weak supervisor. This topic is for the supervisor. I want you to watch this show and then go back and evaluate yourself to make sure that you're not doing these two things that we're going to mention. These two things that could be considered weak and really disenfranchise your front line. Hey, Russ, how you been? You mind introducing yourself again to our audience?
Not at all, Anthony. My name's Russ Hamilton. I am a former and retired sergeant from California Department of Corrections. I also have worked in the juvenile correctional field, and currently I work as a reentry and rehabilitation case management specialist for a private company that we work with parolees and probationers in my county.
Whoa, case management specialist. I think that's the first time I heard you use that title.
Well, maybe that's not the exact title, but
hey, I'll take it, man. I love the fact that you're happy and you're proud of the work that you're doing, Russ. I think that's pretty cool. So, case management specialist. If that's the title that you embrace it. I love it. I love it. So you know what? I'm sorry. I'm not going to call you Russ anymore. For today's show, your name is Mr. Hamilton. So sorry, guys. It's Saturday morning. All right, so working with the weak supervisor, I do have two areas I want to quickly discuss. And guys, again, if you're a supervisor, pay attention because these two weak areas are going to specifically pertain to our dealings with the inmate population. We've done topics before on team building and, looking inwards and all this other stuff to be a better leader. These two topics that we're going to focus on right now, these two tips or insight you got to have is strictly related to our dealings with the inmate population. And be mindful, guys, how we deal with the inmate population is seen every day by that front line. So your actions are always being seen. I have to be careful because if you're seen as weak, front line starts to become disenfranchised. And most of the time, they may not tell you. It just becomes this feeling. So you really have to be aware of your own actions and how that can be perceived by the front line. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll have Russ go first, is I want to talk about weak supervisors that they allow the inmates to circumvent authority. For me, this is the top thing you do not want to do as an inmate. Me and Russ have discussed before about perception of authority and how as supervisors, we have to do whatever we can to protect that front line's perception of authority. Russ, what's your thoughts on that first one?
Okay, first of all, this is pretty simple, but if you don't think about the things that you're doing, the things that you're telling your staff and the things that you're telling the inmates, you can get way off course in this. And the thing that you want the inmates to always perceive is that the staff that work underneath you have the authority to make decisions. They have the authority to make decisions, and they have the authority to enforce those decisions. One of the things that I always did with the inmates when I was a sergeant is they would come to me and they would want to try and talk to me and they would want to try and tell on staff, and they're not letting us do this, that, or the other thing. And my first response to them was always, do you even have permission to talk to me? And the reason that I would couch it in that way is I wanted them to know where the final authority stood. Yes, they might be able to come to me in some way when that particular staff member is out of line or doesn't know what they're doing. But ultimately, almost everything I wanted them to perceive as resting with that staff member. That way, the inmate has to deal with the staff member and the staff member has to deal with the inmate. And eventually, the staff member will get better at dealing with the inmates if they're not already right there. and they have, you know, that feeling of confidence in me that I'm going to back their play and that I'm going to give them that tool that they need, which is final authority. Final authority stops a lot of nonsense. It keeps the inmates from getting chesty and feeling that they can just, you know, go around the decision. It puts them in a position where they understand that what this individual, this staff member is telling them is indeed correct. And it makes them not want to try and press issues and just simply try and manipulate things, because these are very manipulative people. There's no doubt about that. You can see it every day. So they will always seek to try and undermine the authority of the lower staff member in favor of the upper staff member.
Yeah, it's exactly what I say here. So, guys, I'm doing this daily reader, and for January 7th, I put circumvent authority as an action taken by a manipulative inmate that should never be allowed by any staff member. Staff must be vigilant of the different games manipulative inmates will play to circumvent different levels of authority to gain access to the highest level. We call this shopping for staff, technically. Supervisors must also play a role in not allowing this game to occur. Since supervisors are usually the ones being targeted due to their level of authority over subordinate staff, it's paramount for supervisors to step up and any game played by the inmate that weakens the level below them. You know, I'll give you an example, because this doesn't just happen on the immediate level from officer to sergeant, but could be seen as the inmates try to move their way up to lieutenant, captain, administration, especially through the JPay or the grievance systems. Now, mind you, sometimes inmates may not like a decision made by the frontline officer, the frontline staff member. So they have these routes that they can take, which are all the way up to admin. Now, by the way, if they have a problem with a frontline officer, as long as there's no conflict, you got a sergeant that tours the unit. You know, and problem with the sergeant, you have a lieutenant. So inmates are offered the opportunity to follow that chain of command, to not break and circumvent levels of authority. Now the sad thing is, if we're not doing our due diligence, if we're not doing our job as supervisors and we're not touring, so let's say the inmate does have an issue with an officer, and then the sergeant sergeant's not showing up on the unit. Well, now the lieutenant's going to hit that. Because now the lieutenant is going to now be the next level of authority. And so we always have to make sure that the inmates get to see those different levels of authority so they can be reinforced back to where they need to be. Like if I'm a lieutenant and my sergeant's not touring, the problem is now as a lieutenant, I have to answer a concern that really should have been dealt with by the sergeant. And then hopefully, like Russ said, the sergeant's doing what they can to reinforce that back down to the officer. Now, guys, inmates are going to circumvent until they get to the highest level. So even if you're admin, and let's say they write something up on a grievance that requires you to maybe have to go down and see them, because sometimes it happens. And by the way, it's not that the inmate's saying something that's motivating you to get down there. It's just there's something there that has to be followed up on. When you go down there as administration, your job really is, okay, I'll hear the inmate's concern, but then I'm going to look over to the supervisor, either lieutenant or sergeant, whoever's with me, to work with them so the inmate sees that we're working together. I'll even go as far as letting the inmate know that I'm in this custody member's house. Because in the end, I don't want to be that person that allows that inmate to circumvent that authority, because the problem is if I allow that to happen, that inmate is not going to go to officers. They're not going to go to the sergeant. They're not going to go to lieutenant. They're going to be going right to me. So even as you answer, even if it's the most simplistic issue, you still have to make sure that the solution and the authority kind of goes back to where it needs to be. So what I'll do is, okay, this is what we're going to do, blah, blah, blah. Captain, or major, bring it down to the lieutenant. The lieutenant gets the idea, they'll bring it down to the sergeant. The sergeant gets the idea, they'll bring it down to the officer. The officer implements it out within the discretion of, as long as you don't break through what's expected. But again, you empower the officer to carry it out. So at all times, they know for a fact that it's the officer at the front line that ultimately has say in what's going to happen. Because if you keep on, and this is the biggest concern, if you keep on at the highest level being a resource for the inmates, then the inmates are never going to go to the front line for anything. And if they do get conflict with that front line, they're going to use you as an excuse, and it's the highest level. I'll guarantee you that right now. If I'm tight with the sergeant and I don't like what the officer's saying, I'll just go, well, I'll just go to Sergeant Hamilton. I'll just go to Sergeant Hamilton. But then you get the inmates that think because they clean admin that they have a connection with admin. So what they'll say is that if they have a problem with an officer, they'll be like, all right, well, I clean Mr. Hamilton's office, so I'll see what he thinks when I discuss it with them. That's why it's very important, if you're in those higher positions, your interaction with the inmates are very, very limited. Reason being is because there's a perception being played here. It's like sharing the spotlight, if you will. So here I am. I may be chatting with this inmate, but now, unfortunately, the way staff sees it is that, you know what, they've been chatting for a long time. You know, my concern is, does that inmate have influence on that administrator who's at the highest of levels? And if that's the case, staff is just going to get disenfranchised, and they're going to buy into what that inmate is saying, which is, you know, I'm going to go ahead and talk to Mr. Hamilton. He'll handle that concern for me. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, you know, the easiest lens to look through this at when you're dealing with inmates is you should be asking yourself this question is this a conversation that I should just be shutting down? Should I just be referring him back down the chain? And don't get yourself into that position of ego and pride where that inmate is stroking your ego and then expecting you to just, you know, take over that decision and to render it favorably for him, because that's what inmates do. We expect that of him, but instead you should be short-circuiting that, sending it back down the chain, and putting this guy into a position where he has to deal with things in the chain of command as it unfolds. There's other ways for them to, you know, get beyond that within the grievance system and so forth, but don't let them shortchange all that, because that's a sign of manipulation, and that's a sign that they're trying to color outside the lines, and they're trying to do things that are sketchy as heck.
Yeah, and guys, the good thing about this all right now is if you're the higher level and you're a supervisor, when you make a decision, try to do what you can to empower the front line to carry that out. Because I think that to me is the key. Because again, if the inmates go right to you and then you make changes, and it's kind of like in direct dialogue with the inmate. So the inmate mentions this, and you I'm going to go ahead and change this and change that without bringing it back to the front line and having them carry it out. You open up a Pandora's box of direct communication that really should be very limited. If staff got to follow chain of command, so do the inmates. And sometimes, one last thing, that also plays out in regards to how you're supposed to be visible to the inmate population. I get it. And maybe even somewhat approachable in regards to cordial, like, hey, how's everything going? And, you know, keeping things moving. But the access to that supervisor has to be somewhat controlled, especially as you go to the higher levels. I don't think an inmate should have the same access to a sergeant as they would a lieutenant, you know, as they would a captain, as they would an administration. As you get higher up, the access should limit, you know. So again, you know, visible, approachable, but access should be very much limited. Yeah, Russ, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to point out what you're saying is perfect and spot on. But, you know, if you think about it in this way, instead of, you know, trying to, you know, engage with the inmate and solve his problem, tell him what the steps are that he needs to solve the problem. Put him back on that whole thing about the chain of command, and he has to fill out the grievance, and he has to do level 1 and stuff, and then tell him, and then if it makes it to me at that point, then I will be, you know, addressing this. But you need to do what policy and procedure demands, and always use that as your fallback thing. You know, there's a tendency on some people, I'm not going to say it's everyone, but, you know, they want to be the one that's large and in charge and demonstrating that they have the authority. And all you're doing is you're just undercutting those people below you.
Yes. And that's something you do not want to do. Now, the last one, the last tip is when you have supervisors that are very inconsistent in their practices. And again, guys, policy and procedure is a lot different than our practices. Practices are usually built out of convenience in some cases. And when you have supervisors that are very inconsistent in their practices, then unfortunately the front line becomes less confident in what the supervisors are able to accomplish, or even go so far as being effective. What's your thoughts on this, Russ?
Yeah, this really goes to leadership, right? Because if you're constantly, giving, conflicting types of, orders or direction to staff, they're just not going to know what to expect. Okay, this week we're taking something away from the inmates in these searches, and then the next week we aren't. And, maybe there's no clear direction from policy and procedure on that. And, 1 week we're doing something one way, and the next week we're doing it the other. That's difficult for the inmate population to accept. That's difficult for, staff to accept. Be the one that really goes in there and tells your people, what your expectations are and how you want to handle things and the direction you want to go, and then just simply stick with it. Be the one that, day in and day out, things remain the same without making it, so that it's a drag on everybody, but just in a manner so that people can follow it. They know what to expect. They know that if they're following what you've told them, that they're going to be on solid ground, and they're not going to become disenfranchised and feel like they have no say in the process, and that there's just this constant shifting sand under their feet. And, unfortunately, that's actually a strategy of some supervisors to make their staff feel like that, because they want to be the ones to micromanage them.
Yeah, and guys, I want to add something else to this too. Sometimes inconsistency also comes when you have a supervisor that doesn't know how to say no. It's going to come in either the form of they're afraid to say no. Maybe they just have the inability to do it, or it's more convenient for them to say yes because the inmate's annoying, and I know if they say no, the inmate's going to keep on bothering them. So what they do is, instead of stepping up and dealing with this, it becomes more convenient for them to say the no. I'm say the yes, as opposed to doing what's right and saying the no, and just really dealing with that concern. So again, guys, inconsistency is a big issue, because staff really need to know what's expected of their supervisor so they can be effective. But I will say, it's not just finding consistency within that one supervisor, but all the supervisors should be working together to find consistency amongst each other. Hey, Russ, you have any closing thoughts?
Just this, if you're a supervisor out there at whatever level, think first and foremost about how the interactions that you have with inmates affect your staff. Don't shortcut your staff. Put them in a position where they not only have the authority, but they have the ability to grow in that position, so that you can cede more and more power to them, and it'll actually work out good for you in the long run. Don't be in this idea that, hey, only I know how to deal with inmates. Only I know how to address them. I am the best at it that ever was been, because I guarantee that you're not.
And guys, this is so spot on, guys. We just wanted to have this topic because, again, this is really dealing with our interactions with the inmates as supervisors and how we're perceived by the front line. So be vigilant. Ask yourself and look inwards, and how is this perceived by the front line every time I have an interaction with an inmate population? Is everything I'm doing reinforcing the front line's level of authority, both outwards and inwards? As always, guys, the show is Tirto. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.